and welcome to Shakespeare's hometown of Stratford-on-Avon. I'm Juliet, I'm a history lecturer at a British university. This is Freya. The weather is just about gloomy enough to be atmospheric for a ghost tour, so join us as we take you on a historical ghost tour of Shakespeare's home. We are armed with Warwickshire ghost stories, paranormal Warwickshire, the internet, and behind the camera is my best friend Sam Basnett Illustration. Check out her TikTok and her Instagram. And we will go straight away to our first stop, the Royal Shakespeare Theatre.
William Shakespeare was born on the 23rd of April 1564 and died on the same day in 1616, aged 52. He lived during the reigns of Queen Elizabeth I of England and King James I of England, who was already James VI of Scotland. At the beginning of Elizabeth's reign in 1558, many plays were miracle plays, retellings of stories from the Bible, a tradition that lives on in British school nativity plays. However, these were associated with Catholic ritual and tradition. Elizabeth had inherited the throne from her Catholic sister Mary I, but she herself was Protestant and, even more importantly, the Catholic Church considered her to be illegitimate. When their father Henry VIII asked the Pope to annul his marriage to Mary's mother Catherine of Aragon on the grounds that she was his brother's widow and he shouldn't have married her in the first place, the Pope refused. And, long story short, Henry created the Church of England with himself as the head of it, getting Parliament to pass the Act of Supremacy in 1534, and then getting the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, to declare his marriage to Catherine of Aragon to be against the law of God, so that he could divorce her and marry Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother. So Mary and Elizabeth's respective religious positions weren't just about faith, they were about legitimacy. The Catholic Church considered Mary to be legitimate and Elizabeth illegitimate, so Mary persecuted Protestants. The Church of England, on the other hand, considered Mary to be illegitimate and Elizabeth legitimate. Elizabeth was not quite as keen to burn the opposition alive as Mary had been, but she was perfectly willing to be cutthroat about it when she needed to be. All this resulted in Elizabeth's Privy Council declaring that mystery plays were too Catholic and should be discontinued, thus changing the face of English theatre. Instead, groups of actors toured the country performing secular plays, always making sure they were properly authorised by one lord or another so they wouldn't be arrested for vagrancy. They played mostly in the gardens or yards of inns or in wealthy private homes, and there's a great example of one of these acting troupes in Shakespeare's own play, Hamlet. It was in London that, in the 1570s, people started to build permanent playhouses, or theatres. One was just called the Theatre, another the Curtain. The name, of course, comes from the Greek theatres, where Greek plays used to be performed in the ancient world. Other towns and cities like Bristol soon followed, but London was the heart of the business. The theatre was eventually pulled down and rebuilt in 1599 as the Globe. But in smaller towns like Stratford, permanent theatres were a much later arrival. Eventually, however, the residents of Stratford-upon-Avon started to build places in memory of their most famous son where his plays could be performed. The first was David Garrick's Jubilee Pavilion, built in 1769, and there have been at least 17 buildings used to perform Shakespeare's plays in Stratford since then. The original Shakespeare Memorial Theatre was built by the River Avon between 1875 and 1879, with money donated by a local brewer, Charles Edward Flower, but it burned down in 1926. It was rebuilt on an adjacent site, and the new Shakespeare Memorial Theatre opened in 1932, the first public building in England to be designed by a female architect, Elizabeth Whitworth Scott. The Royal Shakespeare Company was founded by Peter Hall in 1961 and took over the theatre, renaming it the Royal Shakespeare Theatre. It was temporarily closed in 2007 for massive renovation work. The Royal Shakespeare Theatre and adjoining Swan Theatre reopened fully in 2011, and if you're in Stratford, it's well worth getting tickets if you can.
Like all theatres, the Royal Shakespeare Theatre has its ghosts. So according to Paranormal Warwickshire, a grey lady is often seen. She appears so real, she's often mistaken for a lost theatre-goer. She is thought by many to be the spirit of Elizabeth Scott, and she is one of the theatre's most well-known ghosts. Another regular encounter, according to Paranormal Warwickshire, is the perfumed lady who has been observed by front-of-house staff in the upper circle. We're going to come back to the perfumed lady a little bit later on.
We wandered over to have a look at the river, but Freya was hissed at by a swan, so we swiftly turned back in the other direction to head towards the next stop on our tour.
Right, having escaped the swan attack, we are heading off toward Nash's house and the site of Shakespeare's old home. I'm very excited to do this ghost tour because although you might know if you've watched some of my other videos, the vast majority of my ancestors are either Irish or Ulster Scots, I have one English branch of my family and this is where they lived. They came from a small village called Fenny Compton in Warwickshire, and then my great-great-grandfather ran the railway station in Stratford-on-Avon for a little while, and then he ran one of the stops on our tour for a few years, so we will come back to that in a little while. But in the meantime, we're heading past the theatre and off in the direction of Nash's house, and thankfully away from the swans.
We were on our way to the site of Shakespeare's family home in Stratford-upon-Avon, where he and his family lived from 1597 until his death, known as New Place. Although Shakespeare spent most of his working life in London, his wife and children lived here in Stratford, and Shakespeare himself died here in 1616.
This is New Place. This is where Shakespeare lived when he was at home in Stratford-on-Avon and not down in London working on his plays. However, it was, according to Paranormal Warwickshire, demolished in 1759 in a fit of spite by Reverend Francis Gastrell, a priest who owned the property and got so fed up with Shakespeare tourists he decided to burn the house down. As you can see, it's open as a tourist attraction, so the attempt to stop the tourists by destroying the house was an abject failure. It is also next door to Nash's place. Follow me.
Nash's house is an early 16th century building that was once owned by Shakespeare's grandson-in-law Thomas Nash. He was married to Shakespeare's granddaughter Elizabeth, daughter of Susanna Shakespeare and Dr. John Hall. Shakespeare was never able to take advantage of the fact it was next door to his own home because unfortunately he was long dead. He died in 1616, Elizabeth married Thomas Nash in 1626, and her mother Susanna first came into possession of the house in 1637.
This is Nash's place, and this is the next stop on our ghost tour. We're not going in because of course we have the dog with us, but as you can see it is also a visitor attraction and is open to visitors. We're also going to let the bus go past.
Yep. Sightseeing Stratford.
Nash's house is thought to have a ghostly resident. One evening, a builder was investigating an alarm that had triggered unexpectedly. After completing all his checks on the first floor and finding no obvious fault, he went down the stairs. The stairs were uneven and dark, so he lit his path by taking photos on his phone with the flash guiding his way. He still found no obvious reason for the alarm to have gone off. Later, he looked at his photos, and on one he had captured in the right-hand side of the photo, near the bottom of the staircase, a little boy's face with a white collar and sleeves. That's creepy.
From Nash's house, we carried on a little way down Chapel Street and then dodged the traffic to turn right back towards the river onto Sheep Street to stop off at our next destination. Another 16th century building which, according to Shakespeare'sstratford.com, is one of the most haunted buildings in England. There are quite a lot of most haunted buildings in England, I should say.
We've now walked down Sheep Street and we have reached Shrieve's house, which is now a living history tourist attraction going by the name of Tudor World. But Shrieve's house was its name before. Shrieve was an archer in the service of Henry VIII, and it is thought that he is the ghost that haunts the building, possibly because he's the person that people know that lived in the building. Anyway, Shrieve's house has proved a popular venue for ghost hunts in recent years, and many other spooks have allegedly been identified here. This is according to Warwickshire Ghost Stories. The staff blame the mysterious moving around of objects overnight on the spirit of a mischievous young girl, so that's not Shrieve, obviously. But by far the most alarming ghost claim for Shrieve's house is a dark hooded figure with red glowing eyes, which has been seen looming out of the darkness. Interesting. That just reminds me of some old election posters from the UK. Tell me in the comments if you're old enough to remember those.
We needed to double back on ourselves, but for the sake of a more interesting walk, we went back to the river to loop around and come back up the widest street in Stratford, Bridge Street, which seemed as good a place as any to talk about a ghost who apparently haunts the whole town.
Warwickshire Ghost Stories also has a section about a ghost who is apparently seen in several different places in Stratford, whose name is Lucy. So it says, we must consider Lucy, who has the distinction of haunting a number of different locations around Stratford-upon-Avon. Lucy was supposedly an unfortunate child who, pronounced dead after a fever, was sold by her poverty-stricken parents to a doctor who wanted to dissect her body. But she wasn't dead, merely unconscious. The consequences of this error are too horrible to contemplate. Yes, they are. Thank you, let's not. The girl's remarkably cheerful spirit, considering the circumstances, turns up in various places in the town centre. One source states that in life Lucy had been a pickpocket, and witnesses have reported feeling her icy little fingers tugging at rings on their fingers and attempting to remove coins from their pockets. I think we're okay.
I'm good. I've not felt anything weird. Nobody's been groping in my pockets. I'm okay.
No, we're good. We're good. Although I should say that bizarrely, this theme of burying people who are not yet dead is going to repeat again a little bit later. Stratford, seriously. What are you doing?
I was hoping to find a pet shop where I could get Freya some treats as we headed into Stratford's main shopping area, but unfortunately we didn't see one. But she was a very good girl as we carried on towards the statue of Shakespeare that stands proudly in the middle of the street near to his birthplace. When we got there, we found the statue absolutely swarming with tourists, far more than had been around in February when I was able to get a nice snap of it. Having rescued Freya from a close encounter with a bottom sniffer that caused her to yelp rather uncharacteristically, we were looking for a building that used to be a pub called the White Lion but had no luck finding it, for good reason, as we were about to find out.
So we couldn't find the building we were looking for because it's a pub that is temporarily closed and we can't see any buildings that look like a pub called the White Lion. And we couldn't film in front of the statue of Shakespeare, which stands here near his birthplace, because there are too many other tourists. So we're filming Shakespeare's behind while we talk about another Warwickshire ghost stories example. Near to Shakespeare's birthplace is apparently one of the most celebrated inns of 18th century England, the White Lion, before it was demolished. That's why. The inn was spread over 16 to 18 Henley Street. The buildings now occupying this space, and that does explain why we couldn't identify them, are said to be haunted by a serial killer of the 1700s called the so-called Stratford Ripper. In 1788, the Stratford Ripper stabbed to death and mutilated the body of a prostitute at the White Lion. Before his execution, he admitted to murdering 5 other women. His knife-wielding spectre has allegedly chased ghost hunters away from their investigations. You know, I'm not sad that we can't find this building. I think we're good. We will admire Shakespeare's beautiful behind instead. And now, on to the great man's birthplace.
I said earlier that Shakespeare was born on the same day he died 52 years later, the 23rd of April. But I should fess up here that we don't actually know that for sure. His exact date of birth was not recorded, but his baptism was recorded in the local parish register on Wednesday the 26th of April 1564. And baptisms at that time typically took place within 3 days of the birth, so he was most likely born on one of the 23rd, the 24th or the 25th of April. Because people like to attach specific dates to things, and because of the irony of the idea that he died on his birthday, 23rd of April has come to be reported as his birth date. He may actually have died at the age of 51, just before his birthday. This house was Shakespeare's father John Shakespeare's home, and would have been where Shakespeare was born, as in Europe most people were born at home or in a friend or family member's house throughout pretty much most of history until recently. William was the third of 8 children and was able to attend the local grammar school because in 1568 John Shakespeare was elected mayor of Stratford. When William married Anne Hathaway in 1582, when he was 18 and she was 26, they moved into his parents' house and lived there for several years, and all 3 of their own children were also born there. The eldest, Susanna, was born 6 months after their wedding. The house was eventually inherited by Elizabeth Nash, who had no children and at the time of her death was Shakespeare's last surviving direct descendant. It then passed to the descendants of Shakespeare's sister Joan Hart until much later in 1806, when the Harts sold it to a butcher called Thomas Court. It was put up for sale again in 1846 after both Court and his wife had died, and a public campaign supported by Charles Dickens was launched to save it. The result of that campaign was that the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust bought it at auction for £3,000 in 1847 and have cared for it ever since.
So here we are. This is Shakespeare's birthplace, which is of course where many of the tourists congregate. It's very well preserved. It's a tourist attraction. You can visit it, but of course we have the pup with us. Apparently, Shakespeare's birthplace is haunted by a friendly ghost. She is described by the author of Haunted Warwickshire, so another book that I don't own because I could not find a copy of it for love nor money, even on Amazon, as a small old lady with snow white hair and rosy cheeks wearing an old-fashioned black dress and a black cap. She appears in an upstairs room, not sure which one, sitting at a spinning wheel. On one occasion in the 1940s, she suddenly materialised in front of a group of startled visitors. Smiling sweetly, she said, "Good day, my dears," and then vanished. Behind Shakespeare's birthplace is a non-Shakespeare related site that I feel the need to point out though because I love it, which is the Christmas shop. If you come to Stratford-upon-Avon, definitely make a stop in the Christmas shop. We don't have very many all year round Christmas shops in this country. This is one of the few that we do have. It's really big, gorgeous Christmas decorations. My mother-in-law bought me a beautiful Santa tree decoration from here once. So if you're visiting Shakespeare's birthplace, stop in the Christmas shop while you're here.
As we panned the camera around to look at the Christmas shop, we caught the lovely Jess and Alexa on film and stopped for a chat. Then Sam told me there was a corgi Christmas tree ornament on sale in the shop, so I just had to go in and buy it. By then we were getting pretty hungry, so we continued on up Henley Street until we hit Windsor Street and then turned left to head to our chosen lunch spot, which was, of course, also haunted.
We have reached our lunch destination. The website promises it is dog friendly, but more importantly, My great-great-grandfather actually ran this pub for a few years, just over 100 years ago. So this is a little bit of my family history. So I'm really excited to go and have lunch here. It's always been good when we've eaten here before. It's also very haunted, but we'll get inside, get ourselves some food and get sat down, and then we'll talk to you about the ghost stories associated with this pub.
We had a moment of panic when it looked like the pub was closed, but to our relief, we were only 2 minutes early for its 12:30 p.m. opening time. So here we are in the Old Thatch Tavern having lunch. Cheers! So, the pub itself has a board up explaining some of its history and that it has more spirits than you might expect. Built in 1470, it is Stratford's oldest pub and only thatched building. Obviously, you can observe that by walking around. On Christmas Day 1795, there was an altercation between the townspeople and a platoon of Irish dragoons that ended with the murder of a local man, Joseph Pinfield. He tried to seek refuge in the thatch, in the Old Thatch Tavern, but was dragged from the door and murdered a few yards away. His spirit remains with us to this day. And that is not the only ghost haunting this pub. The Stratford-upon-Avon Herald also notes that this is possibly the most haunted pub in the district. It has 4 ghosts, a glass-smashing poltergeist, and a mysterious weeping girl in the toilet, as well as, of course, the ghost of Joseph Pinfield that we've already mentioned. At this point, Sam pointed out that we're missing a ghost. That's only 3. That's actually only 3 ghosts? There must be another one that the Herald didn't want to tell us about. Maybe it's really bad. But it is a very nice pub, and I am glad to be back in my old family haunt. See what I did there? Do you know, when we were looking in and they hadn't quite opened and we were going, oh, there's no one inside, I did think I saw an old man sitting at one of the tables. So it could have been a ghost, or it could have been the bust of Shakespeare that's sitting by one of the tables. But you never know. Sam, Freya and I all enjoyed a very good meal. Freya was especially spoiled, getting not only a treat or two, but quite a few of my chips, though I did make her work for it by doing her favourite trick, a high five.
That is very beautiful, but not very useful looking building. Who is using that door? Who is going through there?
We paused outside the pub to investigate the Shakespeare Memorial Fountain, a commemorative clock tower complete with horse drinking trough built by Jethro Cousins of Birmingham and paid for by American publisher George William Childs on the occasion of Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee in 1887. Then we headed towards our next destination. Our route was a big circle starting and finishing at the Royal Shakespeare Theatre. From the memorial, we headed away from the town centre, down Rother Street, and then turned left onto Chestnut Walk, turning back towards the river again.
This is Hall's Croft. Hall's Croft once belonged to Shakespeare's eldest daughter, Susanna, and her husband, Dr. Jonathan Hall. Dr. Hall was Stratford's most esteemed physician, and Hall's Croft now showcases a display of his surgical equipment.
Unfortunately, Hall's Croft, which is another property managed by the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, is currently closed to the public until further notice. The website makes a reference to challenging times, so presumably they don't have the funding to keep it open at the moment. It is also, as I found out, on a rather busy road.
Of course, we are here because, according to Warwickshire Ghost Stories, it has also been the site of some haunting. In this case, a ghostly figure sporting an Elizabethan ruff has been seen peering down from a first-floor window, which, of course, people think might be the apparition of Dr. Hall, because he's a famous person who lived here. In fairness, I believe, if I remember my fashion history correctly, that ruffs were not in fashion for all that long. If this ghost is in the fashion of that very specific period, then it could be Dr. Hall. He is not the only ghost to haunt Hall's Croft. Betty Leggett shared the house with her sister in the years before the First World War, but died in a fall down the stairs. Her spirit has been blamed for the uncomfortable sensation some visitors have felt when descending the stairs, a sharp push in the back by invisible hands. It has been suggested that this is Betty's way of communicating that her accident was actually murder. That is pretty grim. We are, of course, not going in. But if that's the story, then yeah, that's another one that I do not wish to experience. Thank you very much.
From Hall's Croft, we continued towards the river to reach Holy Trinity Church, where Shakespeare was baptised, married, and where he and his wife Anne are both buried. He also had the title of lay rector here. There has been a church on this site since a wooden Saxon monastery was built in 845. A Norman stone church was built over the site by 1086, and the current transepts, which is the horizontal bit of the cross shape of a medieval Christian church, and the tower were built around 1210. Building work, renovations and extensions continued through the 14th century, and a new chancel, that's the space around the altar, was built between 1465 and 1490. The church continued to be added to, for example with the north porch in 1485, and of course the English Reformation saw the removal of Catholic features like the rood screen that stood between the priest and the people, when Henry VIII made all English churches part of the Church of England instead of the Catholic Church.
We have now reached Holy Trinity Church. This is where Shakespeare is buried. Unfortunately, the church is closed at the moment for a funeral, so we can't go inside today. Here is a picture from the internet of Shakespeare's grave. I have seen Shakespeare's grave before. I can promise you it is there, but we can't go in today. Shakespeare's grave is famous for having on it a curse which reads, "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." Now, nobody has ever tested whether there is anything to this curse. I don't think anybody wants to try it out. So, as far as we know, to this day, no one has dared to move Shakespeare's bones. This church is also the site of a rather grim story. The ghost actually haunts her home of Clopton House, but it relates to this church. This is according to Paranormal Warwickshire. Charlotte Clopton, following a sudden illness, appeared to have died. Note, appeared to have died. Her funeral was held at Holy Trinity Church, and her coffin was placed in the family crypt. Some months later, her mother died, and again a funeral was held, and the crypt opened to admit her. At this point, they discovered Charlotte's body slumped against the wall. She had awoken from her catatonic state, fought her way out of her coffin, but had been unable to break out of the tomb and had obviously survived for some time before dying of starvation. It's a pretty grim story. Paranormal Warwickshire announced that stories abound of her unquiet spirit haunting the area, mostly a particular room in Clopton House, but obviously this is where she actually died. Some people have wondered if this is part of the inspiration for the story of Romeo and Juliet. Now, Romeo and Juliet is based on an Italian folk tale, so Shakespeare didn't make up the plot. It does come from an older story. But Stratford does seem to have a disturbing habit of burying or dissecting young women who aren't actually dead. So maybe that's why Shakespeare felt inspired by that particular folk tale? Who knows? Let's face it, either way it's pretty grim.
From Holy Trinity Church, a beautiful riverside walk took us back to the theatre where we started. On the way, we passed Stratford's old chain ferry, a tiny ferry pulled by a chain to take people across the river, which was built in 1937 and was the last of its kind to be made and used in Britain. You certainly don't see very many of them about today. The ferry is still running, it's great fun and very reasonably priced, but we didn't need it today as our final destination was still on this side of the river, and indeed attached to our first destination.
We have reached the end of our tour. We have ended back where we began. The Swan Theatre is actually attached to the Royal Shakespeare Theatre. They are both Royal Shakespeare Company theatres. Sam has reminded me that we came to the Swan Theatre when we were in school in Warwickshire to see a production of Romeo and Juliet in which Juliet was briefly naked during the bedroom scene, which, because we were all about 15 years old at the time, we thought was memorable and quite shocking. Given that the buildings are attached, unsurprisingly, the ghosts haunting the Swan are very much the same as the ghosts haunting the RSC. So the Grey Lady, Elizabeth Scott, is often seen here. A former retail merchandiser at the theatre said, "I was opening up the old Swan shop on a Sunday morning, which included unlocking the Swan Gallery doors and turning the lights on. While in the gallery, I looked at an old RSC costume." They have a collection of classic RSC costumes in the Swan, "and I remember feeling cold, but nothing out of the ordinary. When I returned to my colleague, she said she was surprised to see a visitor viewing the gallery so early in the morning. I said it was only me up there, but she insisted she saw a lady standing behind me while I looked at the costume. The lady wore a long grey dress, and it was all captured on CCTV, but I knew there was no one else in the room but me." Another figure encountered at the theatre is the perfumed lady, who I mentioned all the way back at the beginning. This is also from Paranormal Warwickshire, by the way. The perfumed lady has, as we mentioned earlier, frequently been observed by front of house staff in the upper circle of the Royal Shakespeare Theatre, but she's also a frequent presence around the Swan Theatre. She switches the bridge lights on again no matter how many times they are switched off and checked to be in perfect working order. And of course we know it's that ghost because of the perfume that is her identifying feature. She smells of perfume with nobody in sight. She's not the only ghost in this theatre. One of the stage managers recalls an occasion when audience members were filing into the auditorium just before a play was due to start. A man casually walked from the foyer to the backstage area. Staff tried to stop him, thinking he was someone who didn't know where to go and was heading in the wrong direction. But he disappeared. The stage manager and her colleagues believe he was the ghost of an actor who knew the backstage area very well.
From the Swan, it's a quick step around the back of the theatre to the open area by the river where we started. If you have some time, there is a lovely restaurant at the top of the theatre with gorgeous views of the river where you can get a really nice cream tea. We took my American mother and sister-in-law when they came to visit, as it seemed like a fun English tradition to do, and Sam and I were here again in February with another of our best friends, so we can vouch for the fact that it's still good. You can also go up the tower in the theatre and get even better 360-degree views of the town. But of course, on this day, we had Freya Pup with us. So instead, we got a coffee from a lovely barge selling ice cream and drinks and sat down on a bench outside for a bit.
Thank you so much for coming with us for this historical ghost tour around Stratford-on-Avon. We've been Juliet, Sam Basnett Illustration, and Freya. Do join us next time. Our next planned excursion is to our hometown of Rugby. So you can see where we used to meet boys from the college as teenagers. We might talk about some history and some ghosts as well.
I think we probably will.
Probably. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to my channel for myth, legend, folklore, ghost stories, witchcraft and magic, and weird and wonderful history in general. Thank you. See you next time. Bye!